Okay, today's daf, we're going to learn Shabbat Lamitet. I'll try for a little bit later today to put up the next daf also for the first day of Chag, for those who have 2 days, and for those who not, so for Chag. Today's shir is sponsored by Moshe Schwartz in memory of Rabbi Gershon Schwartz, Rabbi Gershon ben Shmuel B'Sara Zichrono Lebracha, for his 17th yahrzeit, and by Rabbi Seth Phillips in honor of the Daf Yomi learners of Allentown, Pennsylvania. Okay, we're going to review the Mishnah that we started yesterday on Lamed Chet and Bet. So we started with this at the bottom of the page, about 7 lines from the bottom. Ein notnim beitza lamecham b'shvil shetitgalgel v'lo yafki'enu b'sudarim v'Rabbi Yossi matir. Okay, these are 2 separate cases. One is they're both cooking eggs in a way that, since eggs cook very easily, they took the example of eggs. So now they say about the eggs, you can't put an egg next to a hot water boiler, in other words, hot water, that was boiled already, or water, a heated thing of water, in order for it to cook, because that's what we call toldot ha'or. Okay, that means something that was cooked by something cooked on the fire. It's kind of a little less direct than something cooking on the fire. And that everybody agrees with. That's called toldot ha'or or toldot ha'esh, which is something cooked by the fire that now is going to cook something else. V'lo yafki'ena b'sudarim v'Rabbi Yossi matir. Now this is what we call toldot ha'chama. This is something, a sudar, a sheet, was heated by the sun, and then theoretically you could cook an egg on that, like we talked about the tank yesterday. So Rabbi Yossi says this is allowed. Okay, there's a debate regarding this, and we'll see this more in the Gemara. However, the next issue is not a subject of debate, even though theoretically this is also toldot ha'or, and that the Gemara is going to have to explain, which is lo yatminena b'chol u'ba'avak. You can't do hatmana, as we learned before, hatmana, surrounding something entirely in sand or dirt in order for it to be roasted. Okay, so that's not allowed, and the question is, why does Rabbi Yossi disagree there? And now we have this case, and the question is, what's this case coming to teach us also? They basically created, they took this pipe of the chamei tveria and they put inside. There's actually a debate here. Did they put another pipe and run the pipe through of cold water, and then it was heated from the hot water that's in the outer pipe? Or did they actually mix up the waters? Okay, so you ended up with some of the hot springs and some of the regular water. That's another opinion. And then either which way, this is kind of looked at as hatmana, because something is wrapped in something else. Even if it gets mixed up, that could still theoretically be hatmana. Or maybe it's hatmana because there was one pipe inside the other pipe, and then that inner pipe was surrounded entirely by the other pipe of hot water. So they thought this was okay. Amru lahem chachamim im b'Shabbat. If you did this on Shabbat, then it's like chamim shuchmu b'Shabbat, and they're forbidden also for washing and also for drinking. And if you did it on Yom Tov, then it's like water that you heated on Yom Tov, and they're forbidden for washing purposes and allowed for drinking purposes. We're going to get much more into detail today about what's allowed on Shabbat and Yom Tov rechitza. It's relevant because we're going into Yom Tov now. And what's allowed with heating water for these purposes. We'll deal with it more today and a little bit more in tomorrow's stuff. So we buy it. First, the Gemara asks, Gilgel Mai. So what if you did roast this egg using toldot ha'esh? Is that an isur midoraita? Is it basically bishul, the way the Torah says bishul? Or since you're doing it in some kind of indirect manner, not actually with a fire, maybe it's not. Maybe it's only to Rabbanit. So Amar Rav Yosef, Gilgel chayav. You're actually chayav midoraita. And now he's going to, Mar Bered Ravina is going to prove it. Amar Mar Bered Ravina. Af ananami tanina. We also find this in a Mishnah. Okay, now we're going to get a little sidetracked into this Mishnah. We'll explain what this Mishnah means, and then we'll come back to what this means for how we learn from here to our issue. So this is a Mishnah at the near the end of Shabbat. Daf Kuf Mem Hamubet. Kol Shabbat b'chamim milifnei Shabbat. Anything that was cooked in hot water before Shabbat. Okay, I'll just, before I even finish the sentence, if you look in Tosfot says, Perush shenit bashel legamre. Has to be something that was entirely cooked before Shabbat. However, some people say no, it's enough malcha ben drosai. You see this theme that comes up very often, which is every time they say something that was cooked, do they mean fully cooked or partially cooked sufficient. If it was already cooked from before Shabbat, you can put it into something hot, something that was heated up on the fire on Shabbat, meaning not put it on a fire on Shabbat, but you could put it up into water that was heated up on a fire. Okay, the assumption is, and even though they don't say these terms, this is where we get into Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, the first vessel of the set, right? There's a difference also between a Kli Rishon that was on the fire. Let's say you have water boiling on the fire, you took the water off the fire. So theoretically, it sounds like if it was a Kli Rishon off the fire, you'd be allowed, okay, a Kli Rishon is the one that actually had the hot water to begin with, that was heated on the fire, so you could actually put it in there on Shabbat. But if it wasn't put in hot water and boiled up before Shabbat, then, okay, you can't be shoreen, you can't put it in this Kli Rishon. However, you could pour hot water on top of it. Okay, this is what we call in halachic terms, irui, okay, pouring from the Kli. So some people think that there's a debate here, was the first Kli a Kli Rishon or a Kli Sheni, and then are we talking here about Iroi from a Kli Rishon or Iroi from a Kli Sheni? It's a bit of a debate about what exactly the case is. But let's just assume this means you can pour from a Kli Rishon on top of that. Chutz min, other than which case? Hamaliach Yashan v'kulius haspanin. These are types of fish that had, in fact, Rashi says, Kulias haspanin dat shakurin tunina. Okay, it sounds like some sort of tuna. Shahadachatan zohi gemar melachtan. That if you pour water on it, that actually cooks it. This is what we call in halachic terms kalei habishul, things that cook very quickly. And therefore, they're not even allowed, even in pouring from, okay, and then probably pouring from a Kli Rishon, even though some people say pouring from a Kli Sheni, and that's why some people say you can only cook these in the Kli Shlishi, right? The way we make tea, where you would put it into, right? You take the hot water, first cup it goes into is the Kli Rishon, you pour it into a Kli Sheni, and then you can kind of pour. The question is, can you make it in there? Do you need a Kli Shlishi? Anyway, there's a bit of a debate about all these things, which Kli exactly we're talking about. In any case, what does this teach us about our case? Well, this jog that we poured the water on is considered bishul, even though, right, you can't cook it from, you can't be mediach b'chamin, even though, what's the chamin? Toldot ha'or. This is a case where you cooked it with water that was cooked on the fire, and you see that it's forbidden from the Torah. So what do we say? Shma mina. From here you can, okay, now it doesn't say it's forbidden by the Torah, but it does seem to call it bishul, it's cooking it. And therefore, since this is a problem of cooking, therefore it sounds like it's a problem, mida oraita, even cooking with toldot ha'or. Okay. Now we get to the machloket between Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis. These are two other issues. We'll get into these when we get to this Mishnah later on. This Mishnah is at the very end of the Masechet. Basically says you could put a cooked item into a pit in order to protect it from getting destroyed by the sun, or the mayim hayafim bara'im, or good water into bad water. This is like into mikvah water in order to cool it off. But here's the important one for us. Ve'et hatzonein b'chama, you could put cold water into hot water bishvil she'ichamu, in order to warm it up. So the Gemara says, Lema Rabbi Yossi below Rabbanan. This sounds like Rabbi Yossi and not the rabbis, because, sorry, I said this wrong. Et hatzonein b'chama, not into hot water, my mistake. Chama is in the sun. You could put cold water in the sun in order to warm them up. Okay, so now this sounds like Rabbi Yossi allows cooking something that was heated by the sun, like this sudal, and the rabbis don't allow cooking something that was heated by the sun, don't allow cooking with something that was heated by the sun. Then it sounds like this Mishnah, this very Mishnah, which wasn't stated that there was a machloket about it, are we going to say that it's only Rabbi Yossi's opinion that you can heat cold water by the sun below Rabbanan, and it doesn't hold like the rabbis? So Amar Rav Nachman bechama dekule amalo pligi deshari. So now it becomes something interesting. Rav Nachman says, if you heat something by the sun, everybody agrees that that's allowed. Okay, cooking by direct sun, what's the issue here? The issue is, are we concerned that people will think that you can actually cook with fire or cook with something that was cooked by fire? So when it comes to something cooked by the sun, no one's going to get confused and think, oh, if we allow you to cook by the sun, we'll allow you to cook by a fire. So there, everyone agrees that it's allowed. So therefore, that Mishnah, which says you can heat up your cold water by putting it in the sun, that's actually allowed according to everyone. B'toldot ha'ol, if you're cooking from something that was heated up by a fire, like this hot water we talked about before, everybody agrees that that's forbidden. And now we get to what's really their machloket. The whole machloket is something that's heated up by the sun, like this sudal, this sheet. The rabbis say, well, if we allow you to heat up something that was heated up by the sun, we might think that you're allowed to cook with something that was heated up by the fire. So therefore, they forbid that also. Whereas Mar Saval, but Rabbi Yossi holds, lo gazrina. He says there's no reason to worry. If the sun itself is okay, then anything that was heated up by the sun is also going to be okay. So that's the root of their debate, and that's why cooking by the sun directly would not be an issue. Next case, v'lo yatminenu b'chol. So again, just repeating our Mishnah for a quick minute. We started with toldot ha'or. Everybody agrees that's a problem. We moved to toldot ha'chama. That we said is not a problem according to Rabbi Yossi, but is according to the rabbis. But then we have this third case of burying this egg into the sand, and that it said it was a problem according to everybody. So lo yatminenu b'chol. So why doesn't Rabbi Yossi disagree also about this case? So Rabba Amar Gzera Shema Yatmin Beremet. We're going to have two interpretations here and possibly a third later. Rabba says the concern is it's hatmana. You're wrapping it entirely with sand. Well, if you can wrap this egg entirely by sand, people might think that what? We've talked about this before. You're not allowed to wrap something entirely with something that adds heat to it, like has a heating element with coals in it, because you might come to stoke the coals. So if we allow you to do this, you might come to think that we could do other hatmana, and that's the concern. Rabbi Yosef Amar mipnei shemeziz afar min komo. No, the concern is that you're going to move this sand. Now, what's the concern with moving, right? If you want to bury the egg in the sand, what's the issue? You're going to move the sand. What's wrong with moving sand? Well, machloket Rashi Tosfa. Rashi says we're concerned that you're going to dig a hole. Right? We've talked about this before, hofer guma. You're basically moving the sand out for the purposes of having this hole. So you might be end up moving sand, and that's a problem, okay? Tosfot says that can't be the issue because that's a malacha she'ein tzricha legufa. You don't need it for the purposes of what normally, right? You don't really need it for that, and therefore we're going to say, oh, that's not right. This is a case of you really need the dirt, and that's not what the general purpose of the malacha is. And Rabbi Shimon says you're patur, so it can't be that. So he suggests maybe it's okay if you look at the fourth wide line in Tosfot. It says Mefarish Rabbeinu Tam Shemeziz Afar Shehu Muktzah Mim Komo. When you bury the egg, you're moving sand, and sand is muktzah, and that's the problem. It's a muktzah issue. So it's unclear exactly what the issue is, but somehow moving this sand is going to be a problem. So my benayu, what's the difference between the two opinions? Whether you say it's Gzera Shema Yatmin Beremet, or whether you say Mipnei Shemeziz Afar Mim Komo, Ika benayu Afar Tichach. If the dirt is very soft or the sand is very soft, then you don't actually need to move it. You could just stick the egg in without actually having to push the sand aside. So that case, Rabbi Yosef would say it's not a problem, but it would still be a problem of hatmana, of basically surrounding it entirely with something that you might come to think that other kind of hatmana would be allowed, and therefore there would be a difference of opinion between the two. Okay, now we're going to have a number of questions on Rabbi Yosef's opinion that has to do with Mipnei Shemeziz Afar. Meitive. Rashbag Omer, megalgalim beitza al gabe gad roteach. You can put, I don't know why you would do this, but you could put it on a burn. This is kind of like the tank, okay, on your roof. Remember, the roofs in those days, often they would go out on their upper level and they would be on the roof. They would always dry things on the roof. That's where the word muktzah actually comes from. The word muktzah was the area on the roof where they would dry out their fruits to make dry, right? They would dry out their fruits, and it's called the muktzah because it was a designated area. That's what muktzah means. It's designated. It was designated not to be used, basically. They would put the fruits out for a very long time and not have any intent to use them until they're fully dry. And that's something that's kind of set aside for not being used. And that's muktzah, where it's something that's you're not intending to use on Shabbat. So anyway, that's an aside. He says you could roast an egg on top of your burning hot roof. Now, what's the difference between a gag rotach and seed rotach? Seed is plaster. Well, the plaster was boiled up, so that would be toldot ha'ol. And the gag rotach is toldot ha'chama. Okay, so now the assumption is this must be Rabbi Yossi's opinion, who says something heated up by the sun you can cook with. Now, what's the issue? The roof, the assumption is, okay, the roof was made with also dirt or sand or something like this. So, we understand if you say the whole issue with burying it in the sand was because of hatmana. Well, here you're roasting it on your roof. You're not burying it and surrounding it entirely by the dirt that's making up the roof. But if we're worried about you moving dirt, you should also say this is a problem because the roof itself is made from dirt and maybe you'll end up moving dirt aside. So now they say, no, stam gag lepe afar. The average roof doesn't have dirt on it. It's not made of dirt from the ground. So now this is very strange. A minute ago they said it was, and now they say it isn't. Doesn't make so much sense. So most people explain that what they mean here, lepe afar, what they mean is it doesn't have loose dirt. Okay, usually it's kind of plastered together or something. It's not loose dirt that you'll come to move. So therefore, there's no concern of that either, and therefore they've resolved the first question against Rabbi Yossi. Second question, okay, just to remember where we are. Lo yatminenu b'chol. Why does Rabbi Yossi agree when he really thinks that toldot ha'chama is okay? Number one answer, Rabbah, because maybe you'll think it's okay to do hatmana with other things. Second answer is Rav Yosef, which we're dealing with, is because we're worried about you moving dirt. So now let's take our Mishnah itself. Tashma. They took this pipe of, or again, whether it was a pipe or not, but they piped water in cold water into this aqueduct of Mayim Chamim, of Chamei Tveria. So Bishlama, now what's Chamei Tveria? Okay, so this is actually a big question. Why are the hot springs hot? So this is something we're going to see the Gemara grappled with. The assumption is it's heated by the sun, even though it's not exactly, okay? But that's their assumption, and that this would be a case of Toldot Chama. So here we have, Bishlama Lamanda Amar Gzera Shema Yatmin Beremetz. Hainu Didanya Lahatmana. This is what I explained before, that they're going to view this as if it's Hatmana. So if you say that Rabbi Yossi will agree in a case where it's Hatmana, because we might think, as Rabbah says, you'll come to do Hatmana somewhere else, well, then we understand why this was Usher, even according to Rabbi Yossi. Right? Their assumption right now, which we're going to maybe suggest is not a good assumption, their assumption is that Rabbi Yossi agreed. In other words, what happened in that case? The Anshe Tiberia did this. Remember, they prepared this before Shabbat. The rabbis came out and said, you can't use this. And we're assuming that Rabbi Yossi agreed with the rabbis because we don't see him saying otherwise. Although we'll see later that maybe he didn't necessarily. So right now we think he agreed. So if he agreed, so we understand if it's because of Atmana, then that's why. But here there's no dirt, there's nothing that he'd sand, there's nothing that would be moving aside. That's not the issue here. So why would he agree? So the Gemara now says, why are you assuming that the Maaset Tveria comes after the whole case, the sand case, and that it's referring back to that case as if here's a proof, and that's why that would work well if we said according to Rabbi, it's all about Hatmana, and Rabbi Yossi would agree. No, maybe a Reisha Kai, maybe it's actually referring, and not to, Reisha usually means the beginning, it's just relative Reisha, means to the previous case. What was the previous case? The Toldot Chama case, where there was a debate between Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis about cooking it on this sudal, this sheet. So, or a piece of cloth. So he says, this is the way you read the Mishnah. Lo yavki ana b'sudarim, the Rabbi Yossi matir. And then, this actually, the case of Anshe Tveria, was a discussion between the rabbis and Rabbi Yossi. V'hachi ka'amre le Rabbanan le Rabbi Yossi. Hama said Anshe Tveria, de toldot chamahu, v'asre lehu Rabbanan. Look, here's a great proof for us. The case of Chamei Tveria is toldot chama. And look what happened. The rabbi said, you can't do this. And that's proof for us. We must be right. So here comes Rabbi Yossi's answer. You're going to be a little surprised. Amar lehu, hahu toldot ohu. What are you talking about? Chametz Tveria is heated up by a fire. What kind of fire? Where's the fire underneath Chametz Tveria? Dechalpe apitra de gehenom. What does this mean? This means that the waters of, how do the hot springs become hot? Because they're heated up by some fire. What fire? Oh, it's the fire of hell that must be warming up the Chametz Tveria. Okay, why the fire of hell? I guess just because hell was known to be fiery. Okay, they mean basically there's some underground fire that's heating this up. And basically, I don't know if you really believe that there was a fire, but basically saying this isn't like Toldot HaChama. There's something unique going on here. And if we're going to put it in any category, it'll be in Toldot HaEsh. And that's why it was forbidden. And that's why the rabbis forbade it, not because it was Toldot HaChama. So basically, according to this reading, again, this is only a possible reading, right? One possible reading is the first one, according to Rabbah. The whole issue is Shema Yatmin. And because it's Shema Yatmin, therefore, right, Rabbi Yossi will even agree. But according to Rabbi Yosef, who the issue is, you might move the dirt, but otherwise, Toldot HaChama is fine. He just says this isn't a case of Toldot HaChama. Okay, and that it was a debate between the rabbis and him, and the rabbis tried to prove this, and he said you can't prove anything from Chametz Tveria. It could be also, it's just his way of saying, you can't prove that it's Toldot HaChama. This is something unique, and because it's something unique, we can't necessarily learn from here to anything else. Okay. Here we now have a third interpretation, or it's unclear exactly what Rav Chisda is coming to say. Either he's agreeing with Rabbah about Hatmana, or maybe he's even saying something a little bit different. Amar Rav Chisda, ממעשה שעשו אנשי טבריה ואסרו להו רבנן, בטלה הטמנה בדבר המוסיף הבל ואפילו מבעוד יום. Could be he's just coming to say something a little disconnected, but taking the story and learning something from the story. He says, so I'll give you a few options after I read it and explain. From the case of Anshe Tveria, what do you learn here? Now, he obviously views the case of Anshe Tveria as a case of Hatmana. Again, because the cold water is now completely surrounded by the hot spring water, that's basically heating it up in a way that the water is surrounded by something hot. So what do you learn from this? And they did it on Erev Shabbat. So what do we learn? That Hatmana with something that's Mosif Havel, even if you do it on Friday, is forbidden. Now, the statement of Rav Chisda is a little bit strange for a few reasons. First of all, why is he just saying, okay, we can learn this from there? Number two, it's an explicit Mishnah that you can't, we already learned this before, and it's going to come up in the beginning of the next parak, with which things can you do Hatmana and with which items can't. And things that are sources of heat, that create heat, like the Chametz Tveria, which are constantly hot, you're not allowed, and that's the case of the remets, right? You're not allowed to do Hatmana. It says it in the Mishnah. So why would Rav Chisda be telling us something that says explicitly in the Mishnah? And why is he coming to tell us this here? So some people say that he just, first of all, he holds like Rabbah about the issue is Hatmana with the Anshe Tveria, and that the issue and the reason why Rabbi Yossi agrees there is because of a Hatmana. But some people say no. He's a little bit different than Rabbah, because Rabbah said it's a gzera mishum Hatmana beremetz. Okay, it's a gzera that you might come to do it. According to Rav Chisda, he says this is Hatmana beremetz. It's not a gzera because of, it actually is doing Hatmana, and maybe you use it that way. But the real question that was bothering me when I read this was, why is he telling us something we can infer from this story, something it says explicitly in the Mishnah? One possible answer, by the way, could be it's always better if you learn something from story, right? Even though the Mishnah says it later on, well, the Mishnah here implies it from the story. But Tosfot gives, I think, a stronger answer. He gives two different answers. The first one, a little less, but anyway, Tosfot asks exactly this question. If you look at the first Tosfot on the page, he says, "V'itema matzarich lemelach mimased anshe Tveria hamatnitin hi ve'ein tomnim devar mosif hevel." Says it explicitly in the next paragraph. So his first answer is where the lines get narrower, the second line. He says, "Va'omeri dematnitin lekamad ikalu ukma ve'ben hashmasho." Maybe the Mishnah, when it says, what can you do Hatmana and what can't you do Hatmana? Maybe they're not talking about on Friday afternoon. They're talking about in the time of Ben Hashmasha. Okay, it's a bit of a stretch to start explaining that whole Mishnah. And then theoretically from there, one would infer that you could actually do Hatmana with something that adds heat, as long as it's before Ben Hashmasha. And then Rav Chisda says, well, from this Mishnah, you learn even before Ben Hashmasha, you can't, because obviously they weren't doing this. They didn't build this whole contraption, just Ben Hashmasha. But I think the better answer is at the end of Tosfot. He quotes Rav Shmuel Mivradin, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but he says, if you look 5 lines down from the end of Tosfot, Mima'aseh Anshe Tveria, what do you learn from there? B'tela hatmana de'asur afilu le'echol, kitekatane v'asurim b'shtiya. What did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said, okay, and we'll get to now into those details. If you did this, the rabbi said to them, the water is, number 1, forbidden to drink and also forbidden to wash, okay, or forbidden to wash and also to drink. So what's the chiddush of Anshe Tveria? Not so much that it's forbidden to do atmana. That was something that's adding heat. That already we learn in the next parak. But, right, remember, the order doesn't matter in the Mishnah, right? The fact that it says it in some other Mishnah, so it shouldn't bother us here, right? We don't need to teach it now because it's going to teach it later. But what's teaching you in this Mishnah is that if you do it against the law, then the food is forbidden. And this is something we kept discussing earlier, right? If you can't do something, well, what happens to the food? There's 2 issues. Number 1, can you do it or can't you do it? Number 2, if you already do it, well, what's the status of the food? So now what they're telling you is, not only that, what Reb Chista's point is, now let's just read his words and see if we can read it into his words. Now you have to add the words, or what he meant by asru lehu wasn't he forbade them to make it, he forbade them to drink the water. From there you learn that hatmana b'davar mosik hevel, b'tela hatmana b'davar mosik hevel afilu mibod yom. And then you'd have to explain that what he means by this is, if one does hatmana, then the food is forbidden for eating. Okay? And that's his chiddush. Now we have another very strange line. Amar Ula, halacha k'anshe Tveria. We paskin like the people of Tveria. That's really odd, right? Because it seemed quite clear in the Mishnah that we don't paskin like the people of Tveria, right? The rabbi said, you can't do this. And we just explained that even Rabbi Yossi agrees. So how could Ula come up and start saying, we paskin like the people of Tveria? So what one could do is, and this is a good review of what we just learned, which is we had a number of different explanations as to how Rabbi Yossi fits in with this Anshe Tveria story. And we were trying to explain it according to all the opinions, right? One is it's hatmana, according to Rabbah. But theoretically, if you learn like Rabbi Yosef, that told, if you remember, we had the whole question, how do we read the Mishnah according to Rabbi Yosef's interpretation? That the issue of the Anshe Tveria, that the issue of Rabbi Yossi, he'll say it's forbidden, mishum shemeziz afal. And then we said, oh, Rabbi Yossi will say it's forbidden. Why? Because it's actually toldot or not toldot chama, because the fire of hell creates the heat in Chanei Tveria, and that's why. But theoretically, there's another pshat to this Mishnah. It could be that the story of Anshe Tveria is really just the rabbis, and the rabbis were trying to prove their position from here. And maybe Rabbi Yossi actually thinks that it is toldot chama, it's heated up by the sun, and actually it's allowed. And it could be that this is a case where he disagreed with the rabbis. And Ula, interestingly, is actually paskening like Rabbi Yossi, okay? Which is an interesting thing, Michlal, that he would do that, but that's the way it seems to be read. So now, Amalei Rav Nachman says, how could you pasken that way? And here's his proof. Kvar tavlinhu anshe Tveria l'sulunaihu. They already broke their piping system that they created, and clearly they deferred to the rabbis. And if they deferred to the rabbis, then obviously we don't hold this way, okay? And that basically it's not possible that we paskin that way, because even if, let's say, we don't even know if Rabbi Yossi agreed with the rabbis or didn't agree, but let's say even if he disagreed with them, the Anshe Tveria basically already broke their equipment, and they're not doing this, and clearly we don't paskin that way. So he strongly disagrees with Ula. And it's interesting how he proves it. He proves it from what happened bashetach, right? The fact that this is what happened in reality, and they broke their pipes and they don't do this anymore, must prove that that's the right way to go. Okay, which isn't necessarily, right? It's interesting. Sometimes the people, there's always an interesting thing that happens when people start doing something and then the rabbis disagree, right? And maybe some rabbis agree, and then it becomes a debate. Do the people intuitively know? Professor Jacob Katz talked about this a lot, about this halachic intuition of people. And the people often have this halachic intuition. He talks about it. One of the examples he brings is when watches were created. Is a watch considered carrying or not? Is it something that's allowed to carry on Shabbat or not allowed to carry? And we said people started carrying them around without even thinking it was an issue. And then, and then often he talks about where there's a halachic, people start doing something, and then the rabbis start reacting and saying, well, is this okay or is it not okay? Right? It's usually not that the rabbis start discussing it. They only start discussing it once people start doing it, and then they start looking into it. And he says often people have this halachic intuition that they actually have the right halachic intuition. Here the rabbis went against it, but maybe according to Ula, no, maybe the people were really actually right about it. Even though the rabbi, right, and the fact that the people listen to the rabbis doesn't necessarily mean that there's not another opinion in the story. So Rav Nachman's proof, to a certain extent, is proof. On the other hand, maybe, right, it's proof that was the majority opinion. But Ula still thinks, for whatever reason, that we pass like Rabbi Yosef. Now we're going to start getting into the washing issue. Okay, so if you notice, let's go back to the words. It's important. He says, the rabbi said to the people of Tiberia, if you did this on Shabbat, then the water that you heated is going to be forbidden both for drinking and for washing. If you did it on Yom Tov, then the water is going to be forbidden just for washing, but not for drinking. Okay, which seems to imply that one can't heat up water for washing purposes on Yom Tov. Now, it happens, there's a whole debate about this. We'll get to it in Beitza, between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai says that Ochal Nefesh is only for food. Okay, that's things we're allowed to do on Yom Tov. According to Beit Hillel, since we allow it for food, we also allow it for, it's mitoch, since we allow it for this, we allow it also for heating up for washing purposes. And then it's a debate, right? Is washing also considered ochal nefesh or not? And which washing would be considered ochal nefesh? Maybe just, right, which is like a basic need. Maybe it's just washing part of your body, not your whole body. And there's a whole question. This is where the whole issue comes up from Yom Tov. Can you take a shower or not? So now, so now the Gemara asks, my rechitza. What's the rechitza that we're referring to here? If it means, okay, there's two terms of washing that we're going to discuss that the rabbis bring up. One is washing part of your body, and usually it's your hands, your face, and your feet. And one is washing your whole body. That was ways they showered, right? Either they just wash part of their body, like we would do, right? You wash your hands in the sink or your face, or they would do a type shower or a bath, more likely, and that would be that would be your whole body. So if it's talking about your whole body, now, what does it sound like? Now, look what it said in the Mishnah. If you did it, right, then in B'Shabbat, it's like chamin shuchmu b'Shabbat. Since even though you created this contraption before Shabbat, what's happening? Throughout Shabbat, the water is getting heated, so that's like water that was heated on Shabbat. Now that seems to imply what? If it was heated before Shabbat, it would be allowed. Correct? Because it only says it would be like water heated on Shabbat, and then it would be forbidden for rechitza and for shtiyah, which seems to imply just like we can heat up water before Shabbat to drink, right? That's what we do normally. You would also theoretically be allowed to heat up water from before Shabbat to wash. So now, what kind of washing are you allowed to do with water heated up before Shabbat? Okay, this is what we talked about this before, gzerat merchatzaot, okay, which is, what happened was the rabbis, they had these bathhouses, and theoretically you could wash your body, way back when, you'd be able to wash your body on Shabbat with water heated up from before Shabbat. However, what happened in the bathhouses, the balanim, and this is similar to something we saw also just before, which is there's always a concern that people will, this we saw in yesterday's stuff, that people will trick other people, right? They'll do something and claim, remember there was, they'll put the food on and they'll say, oh, I accidentally forgot it on the plata, right, on the fire. I forgot to take it off before Shabbat, when really they left it on purpose. And that's why they forbade, if you remember, we saw that yesterday, they forbade eating the food. That was, even if it was b'shogeg. So now they say, there was a concern with the balanim, the people who worked in the bathhouse, that they were going to heat the water on Shabbat and claim, right, you can imagine for business purposes, right, claim that they did it before Shabbat, so the people would come and use the water, right? Imagine they run out of water, so they might end up heating up water and saying, oh, I did it before Shabbat. So they instituted Gzerat Merchatzaot, which says people are not allowed to wash their bodies. Now, what part of their bodies? Their whole bodies on Shabbat, even with water heated before Shabbat. So if you're going to say that the rechitza mentioned in this Mishnah is rechitzat kol gufo, well, then the Mishnah doesn't make sense, because what did they tell them? It's like water heated on Shabbat. Theoretically, it should be like water heated before Shabbat would also be a problem. So let's read that inside. It sounds dasurin. Sounds like water heated on Shabbat is what's forbidden. Ha-chamim shuchmu me'erev Shabbat would be mutarin. Sounds like water that was, if you had heated it before Shabbat, it would have been allowed. And that's not the case, because Hatanya doesn't it say in a Braita. Chamin shuchmu me'erev Shabbat. If you heated the water before Shabbat, lemachar, what can you do with them on Shabbat? Rochetz behem panav yadav raglav. Avalo kol gufo, you can't wash your whole body. Water heated from before Shabbat can only be used for washing parts of your body. So therefore, when they say rechitza in the Mishnah, it can't be rechitza kol gufo, because that line about Shabbat doesn't make sense. However, if you say, so Ella, what's the assumption then? What's the rechitza? Panav yadav raglav. And then it would make sense, because then it means, since this water's heated on Shabbat, we don't allow you to wash your hands, your feet, and your face with it. If it had been heated before Shabbat, that wouldn't have been a problem. But it's a problem because it's heated on Shabbat. However, that line doesn't work either because of the next part in the Mishnah. What did the Mishnah say? Asu ema seifa b'yom tov kechamin shuchmu b'yom tov asurim b'rechitza mutarim b'shtiyah. Now, this goes back to this machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel I mentioned. Lema tznan stama kebeit Shammai. If you say that water heated on Yom Tov is forbidden to wash your hands, your face, right? And what did it say again? Every time it says rechitza, we're assuming it means now panav yadav raglav, your face, your hands, and your feet. If that's the case, fill that into the latter part of the Mishnah. It says the water you just did is like what if you did it on Yom Tov. You made this you used this contraption on Yom Tov. It would be like water heated on Yom Tov, which is forbidden. But rechitza, what kind of rechitza is it forbidden? Hands, face, and feet. Well, that would only match Beit Shammai's opinion. Ditnan, Beit Shammai omrim, lo yachem adam chamin leraglav elim kem ruyin l'shtiyah. Beit Shammai says you can't heat up water to wash your feet on Yom Tov. He says only, because that's what I said about ochel nefesh, right? It's only for food. If you heated up water for drinking purposes, and then you took some of it, used it to wash your feet, that's okay. But you can't heat it up for washing purposes. Beit Hillel mitirim. Beit Hillel says, no, you're allowed to. Well, according to this then, our Mishnah matches Beit Shammai, because they say basically if you heat it up on Yom Tov, it's like, right? It's like, if you use this on Yom Tov, it's like you heat it on Yom Tov, and it's forbidden b'rechitza. And we already said that rechitza, because of the first part with Shabbat, has to be panav yadav raglav. So that doesn't make any sense. So basically, it can't be kol gufo, because the Shabbat part doesn't make sense, because it seems to imply if we heat it from Erev Shabbat, you'd be allowed to, which you're not. It can't be panav yadav raglav, because the Yom Tov part doesn't make sense, because it seems to imply that you can't heat water up on Yom Tov for your hands, feet, and face. And that matches Beit Shammai, not Beit Hillel, and it doesn't make sense that a simple Mishnah would be Beit Shammai. So, Amar Rav Ika bar Chananya. Now we come and have a creative interpretation of our Mishnah. When the Chachamim talked about this water, they weren't actually talking about rechitza. And you have to understand the reality of their day. They didn't take showers in those days. They didn't have shower heads or anything. What did they do? They took baths usually, right? They would soak themselves in the baths. That was what they did generally in the bathhouse. It was more like a bathtub. So what does he say here? Well, there's a second category. There's rechitza, and there's what we call lihishtatef, which means, it sounds kind of like our shower. Means pouring water on top of you. We saw this when we talked about mikvahs also, the difference between pouring the water on top of you. So now we're going to say that when the Mishnah says rechitza, it doesn't mean rechitza kol haguf. It doesn't mean rechitza panav yadav raglav, because neither of those work. It actually means shtifat kol gufo. Okay? It means not rechitza, even though it says rechitza. They mean pouring water. Okay? And this we have a three-way machloket. Lishtatef behen kol gufo askinim. We're talking about pouring water on your entire body. So, the high Tanahu, and it matches the following Tanaitic opinion. Ditanya, as it says on the Braita, Lo yishtatef adam kol gufo, bein b'chamin, bein b'tzonein divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says you cannot pour water on your body your whole body to wash yourself on Shabbat, whether it's hot or whether it's cold, it doesn't matter. And he basically says he's the extreme opinion on the Machmir side. He says we have to be the most strict about this. Even if the water's cold, we're still worried you might come to heat it up. And even if you're just dumping it on yourself and it's not the general way of washing, still we're going to forbid it because he wanted to stay as far away as possible from people heating up water on Shabbat to shower. Rabbi Shimon Matir. Rabbi Shimon says this is all allowed. Okay, he basically says once we move out of, what was the issue? The issue was Gzeirat Mir Chatzaot. So it's only the way they did it in the bathhouse. In the bathhouse, they did these baths. They didn't pour water on top of themselves generally. So that's only going to be on Rechitza. If it comes to Shtifa, everything's allowed, even hot water. Okay? Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'chamin asur b'tzonei mutar. He's the middle position. When you're talking about throwing water on yourself, well, we're not going to allow hot water because you might come to heat it up on Shabbat, but we do allow cold water. Okay, so how does our Mishnah work out? Well, our Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon's opinion because our Mishnah says, right, what did it say? If you did it, remember, the whole thing was, if you say it's kol gufo, it makes it sound like on Shabbat. If you did it from before Shabbat, it would be allowed. So he says, yeah, oh, by the way, this hot water that he matirs is only hot water that was heated up before Shabbat, obviously. Okay, what we're talking here is, if you want to dump water on your body with water heated up from before Shabbat, you could actually do that according to Rabbi Shimon. Okay, so that's our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon, and that's why he says to them, let's just repeat the line, if it was Shabbat, it's like water heated up on Shabbat, and it's asurim, the rechitza, meaning you can't dump water on yourself with this water that was heated up on Shabbat. Had it been heated up before Shabbat, it would have been allowed, and it's Rabbi Shimon. Okay. However, we don't pass on like Rabbi Shimon, and that's what we're going to see soon. But first, they talk about Amar of Chisda, machloket. This whole machloket between the three of them is bikli. Aval bekarka divrei kol mutal. It's water taken from a utensil, but if it was water from the ground, everyone agrees that it's mutal. Okay, because the kli is more similar. Actually, there's a bunch of different reasons given why kli. What's the difference between kli and ground? But the bathhouses were done in these kelim, like a bathtub. And therefore, the kli is more similar to the way they did in the bathhouse, and that's why they have a machloket. But if it was water from the ground, Divrei HaKol would say it's mutar to do, again, shituv, not bathing. V'ha maaseh d'anshei Tveria b'karka hava. But what do you mean? The maaseh d'anshei Tveria was piping that was in the ground. V'asrei lehu Rabbanan, and they forbade it. So you can't say that b'karka, everyone agrees it's allowed. So they jump it up a notch, and what do they say? What Rav Chisda must have meant to say was like this: Machloket bekarka aval b'kli divrei hakol asur. Everyone would agree kli is still more likely to be asur. Kli, actually, everyone's going to say it's asur. The machloket between them was if it's in the ground, and then that makes sense because then the rabbis say no. The Anshe Tveria thought it was okay, and that's why, based on Rabbi Shimon, okay, so that's how we say this. Now. Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, the last piece for today, Halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda. We paskin not like Rabbi Shimon, but we actually paskin like Rabbi Yehuda on this issue of throwing water on yourself, okay? So that you can use cold water according to this on Shabbat to wash with, if you pour the water on top of yourself and not soak yourself in. So he says, Rabba Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan paskins like Rabbi Yehuda. So Amalei Rav Yosef, did you hear him explicitly say that, Rabbi Yochanan? Or he's asking Rabbi Chama, did you hear him explicitly say that? Or did you derive it from something else he said? So my klala, where could it be derived from? Amar Rav Tanchum, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, because it was said in the name of Rav Tanchum, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Rabbi Yanai, in the name of Rabbi Yanai, Amar Rav, or maybe it's Amar, it should say Rabbi, said in the name of Rabbi. This is very interesting. If you have three opinions, we're always going to go with the middle compromise opinion, right? This is a classic approach, right? Take the middle road. Chutz mi, except for one case, and this is a case we learned about a number of dapim ago, mikule matzlaniot. Remember the beged? We had this little piece of cloth that you decided not to really use anymore as a piece of cloth. You used it as a shmata, and then the question is, if you put it aside, do we start to say, maybe you meant you do want this to be a kli again, and then it can be susceptible to impurity or not? It's a whole three-way debate there. That's the one exception to the rule. Rabbi Akiva Machriya, even though we have Rabbi Akiva being the middle position there, and Halakha K'divrei Machriya, we don't pass like Rabbi Akiva there. It's the one exception to this rule for two reasons. Chada, the Rabbi Akiva Talmidhu, this is interesting. You don't take the compromise position if the person who's the compromiser is the student of one of the people that was in the debate. Then we don't view him as three equals, and that's the compromise. Since he's a student, he has less status, and we don't pass him like him. And Rabbi Akiva was the Talmid. Ve'od, and additionally, Hadrabe Rabbi Akiva l'gabei Rabbi Yoshua. If you remember there, Rabbi Akiva ends up deferring to Rabbi Yoshua. So he himself rejects his own position. That's why. So now, basically the question was asked, Rabbi Chana, did you learn it from here that Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi that we always take the middle position? And is that why? Or did he say specifically about our case? So now we'll just continue a little bit more because we're in the middle here. So, the Gemara says, who cares whether he looked at it either which way? Either Rabbi Yochanan said it directly, or Rabbi Yochanan made this statement, and Rabbi Chana inferred from there that we always follow the middle position. So what would be the difference? Maybe the statement that he said, was anytime you see it in a Mishnah, but in a Braita, not necessarily. And our source was a Braita, so maybe that's why. And maybe therefore he doesn't go this way. Anyway, well, anyway, I heard it from him directly. So your question is out. It doesn't really matter because he actually told me directly, and therefore it doesn't matter how you understand this statement. Was it only Mishnah or only Braita? It doesn't really, even Braita, it doesn't matter because I actually heard him say he paskins like Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, that's the end for today. We're going to talk in tomorrow's shir more about this Gzerat Merchatzaot. Tomorrow will be a little bit more about Yom Tov and what we do and what parts of your body can you wash and how does it work. So stay tuned for Daf Mem.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.